Hi, everybody. I'm John Fuller. Thanks for joining us today. I'm glad you're here. I wish we were doing this face to face, but since we're not, here's how the presentation will go. You can type questions in the Q&A box on your Zoom screens, and I will answer as many as I can at the end. And if we don't get to them all, or if you think of something else later, feel free to email me using the email address I'll give you on the last slide. But we do intend to stick around until people are done asking questions. I'm going to be talking to you today about Gila River Elegy, which tells the story of the Gila River as viewed from the seat of a canoe. Elegies are a kind of story that celebrates someone or something lost to us. They recount the events that shaped a life, finding meaning and beauty and triumphs and failures. You can only write an elegy about something important to you, and usually about something you love. Gila River Elegy, the second of my River Elegy series, is published by Vishnu Temple Press in Flagstaff, Arizona. For the next 45 minutes, I'm going to be telling you a story about a trip I took down the Gila River. Basically, I'll be telling you what I did, why I did it, what I saw, and some lessons I think for all of us from along the way. Let's start with what I did. In 2019, I canoed the entire river alone. I started at the Continental Divide in New Mexico's Black Range at the headwaters of the East Fork of the Gila, and I finished at Yuma, Arizona, where the Gila flows into the Colorado River. If you're at all familiar with the Gila River, no doubt you're thinking, that's impossible. Well, you're right. It is impossible. Because unfortunately, much of the lower Gila now looks like this. But I'm not one to let impossible stand in my way, and I can tell you that I completed the entire trip. What did I really do? Well, first, my lovely wife, Kate, dropped me off in the Gila National Forest at the fire tower on Lookout Mountain on the crest of the Continental Divide, a couple hours north of Silver City, New Mexico. From there, I rode my mountain bike down Forest Road 226A to where it crosses Taylor Creek. And then I backpacked for 2 days along the mostly dry Taylor Creek, through Whitewater Canyon, which is an odd name for a dry creek, past Wall Lake, and on to the confluence with Beaver Creek, which it joins to form the East Fork of the Gila River. Just downstream of the Steeple Ranch at Forest Road 18, I switched to a solo canoe that I'd hidden under a fallen cottonwood a few days earlier. I canoed 25 miles from there to the confluence with the West Fork of the Gila, and then paddled the Gila River for 331 miles to the Ashhurst-Hayden Dam near Florence, Arizona. The Ashhurst-Hayden Dam diverts the entire river into a canal, so I switched to my mountain bike, figuring that if I couldn't paddle the river, I could at least follow its water along the canal system. So I rode a combination of canal maintenance roads, farm roads, river trails, and some short sections of paved roads to the Salt River confluence at Phoenix. At the Salt River, I paddled 4.5 miles on treated sewage effluent until the entire river was once again diverted into an irrigation canal. There, I switched back to my mountain bike and followed the Buckeye and Arlington canals to Gillespie Dam on my bike. At Gillespie Dam, I took advantage of a rare spring release from the Salt and Verde reservoirs and paddled my canoe to Painted Rock, almost. Then it was back on my bike for the last 118 miles of farm roads and trails along the dry riverbed until I reached Yuma in the Colorado River. For the accountants among us, here are some numbers from the trip. Just about every one of them is a good story. But we might need a campfire, some beer, and a few more hours to get through most of them. Or you can read the book. Given all that mayhem and disaster, some of you are no doubt asking yourselves, why ever left the house? Well, that's an easy one. For those of you who love rivers, you know what I mean. For the rest of you, I can only say that I've never had a bad day on a river, no matter what happened. I also feel like I'm a better version of myself, under an open sky with North America as my bed. Adrenaline has always been my drug of choice, even as an old man, and I love traveling alone. Those who say you should never travel alone usually have never done it themselves. Plus, I love through trips. I've done a bunch of them, and I hate the feeling of leaving part of a trail undone. But mostly it's because I've been doing river studies professionally for more than 35 years. I've worked on the Gila many times in those years, and every time I'd see a new reach, I'd dream about paddling it and try to figure out how I could get that done. During one of my Gila River studies, I came across Dutch Salmon's book, Gila River Descending. His book describes his hiking and canoeing journey from the headwaters of the Gila into the Gila box. The trip was a lot like mine, except for that he brought along his hound dog and a stray cat in his canoe. Given my bent towards doing all of something, I've always wondered why he stopped above Safford, whether he could have paddled farther. I asked him that when Kate and I stayed with him during our scouting trip in 2018. He said he didn't think it could be done. Then, during another study, I came across an 1891 story, originally from the Yuma Times and reprinted in the Tombstone Epitaph, that described how two prospectors had built a boat in the Black Range on the East Fork and floated it all the way to Yuma, hunting and trapping for 6 months. As far as we know, those two guys were the first people to float the entire Gila. They were also the last. All I could think was, well, if they could do it, why couldn't I? So, you ready to see the Gila? If you're still unconvinced about why I did it, I hope that seeing just some of what I saw will do the trick. So in the next few slides, I'm going to show you each of the Gila's major sections. For each section, I've listed the distance of that section in river miles and the discharge in that section during my trip under the slide's heading section. The confluence of the east and west forks is the Gila's 0 point, so the 53 miles from the headwaters to there I've listed as a negative on this slide, and that's about as complicated the math as I'm going to hit you with during this talk. The East Fork of the Gila is entirely within the Gila National Forest, and much of it's in the boundaries of the Gila Wilderness. It offers everything you'd expect in a wilderness: open space, mountains, tall trees, wildlife, especially bears, particularly bears, clear skies, clean air, flowing streams. It's truly an amazing place. But it has also the elements of all the things that threaten the rest of the Gila, principally us. Ranchers have been running cattle here since the 1880s. There are several large private inholdings in the forest, and the owners hold grazing leases on much of the surrounding land in the national forest itself. With the ranchers come diversions and no trespassing signs and cattle, and worst of all, barbed wire fences. But there's also loggers and hunters and campers and hikers and other visitors, including the odd boater. All good stuff, but it leaves a footprint and occasionally results in damage. Still, the canyons and forests are wonderful and more pristine and wild than most of the rest of the Gila. I paddled the East Fork, but it should not be considered a paddling destination for anyone but the most committed boaters. At normal, low-flow conditions, there are dozens of beefy strainers that must be portaged, and in many places, it's narrow or too shallow and choked with vegetation to float, particularly in the last 5 miles above the confluence. At higher flows, these same conditions could make it quite dangerous, even for experienced boaters. I know it looks pretty, but you've been warned. The East Fork joins the West Fork to form the main stem of the Gila, which immediately flows into the Gila's Upper Box Canyon. The Upper Box stretches 44 miles from the Highway 15 bridge near the Gila Cliff Dwellings National Monument to the Mogollon Creek River access point, the upper end of the Gila Cliff Valley. It's one of the most popular boating reaches on the Gila. In New Mexico, if somebody says they're going to boat the Gila, they probably mean they're going out to the Upper Box. Most of the Upper Box is within the Gila Wilderness, the nation's first federally designated wilderness area. Consequently, many boaters call this reach the Wilderness Run. During my 650-mile trip, I never saw another boat on the river itself. Of the 12 boaters I saw along the river, I saw all but 2 at the boat ramps and camps in the Upper Box. The other 2 were in Arizona's Gila Box. At the Grapevine Campground put-in, just above the Highway 15 bridge, I met 2 kayakers rigging their boats. We got to chatting, and they turned out to be Todd Schulke, one of the founders of the Center for Biological Diversity, and Patrice Mulchnick, who runs the Heart of the Gila nonprofit. It's one of the characters in the film Hearts on the Gila. Both Todd and Patrice have spent much of their lives fighting to save the Gila. I can't imagine 2 people I would have rather chanced upon at the put-in. The next morning, while scouting a rapid, I walked past a guy and his dog by their tent. I looked at the dog and then at the guy, back at the dog, and they did the same for me. And he blurted out, "You're John Fuller," just as I said, "You're Paul Terry." We'd met by chance 2 weeks prior when Paul had agreed to share his Coon Creek campsite when we were both rafting the Salt River Wilderness Canyon. Todd and Paul were the only 2 people I'd ever met who'd run the Middle Box at that time, and I got lots of great information about running it for both of them. Rivers have a way of bringing people together at just the right time. Boating the Upper Box is pretty straightforward. There's a strong current throughout the box, so the river does most of the work for you. Most of the rapids are Class 1 riffles. There are plenty of Class 2 rapids, which are easily run, even by novice boaters. A few rapids are a bit more complex and may reach the Class 3 level, particularly at higher flows. The rapid in this video shows what I call a cliff turn rapid, which is pretty typical of southwestern canyon rivers, where the current slams into a cliff and wants to take you and your boat with it. Hitting the cliff can easily flip your canoe. And almost did. But most of the rapids are more like this simple Class 2 drop. Strainers are the other hazard to be aware of. Strainers are formed by fallen trees and debris that block the river. The trees are the spaghetti strainer, and you are the spaghetti. Strainers can easily flip a boat, but can be especially dangerous if you get stuck like a spaghetti noodle under the water. The upper box has been threatened for decades. Several plans to dam the Gila and backflood the upper box, or parts of it, have been proposed over the years, but were defeated by vigilant New Mexicans. More recently, the Arizona Water Settlement Act of 2004 created a New Mexico unit of the Central Arizona Project, which was tasked with trying to divert even more water from the already depleted and overallocated Gila. Fortunately, the worst of the diversion schemes were defeated in late 2019 in a rare victory of common sense over politics. I tell this story in more detail in the book, but it has too many twists and turns to do it justice in this short talk. Currently, there's a bill in Congress that will provide further protections to the Gila River by designating the upper box and other parts of the Gila and its New Mexico tributaries as wild and scenic. The bill was named for Dutch Salmon, who passed away in March 2019, just as I was starting my adventure. A wild and scenic designation will help keep the Gila from looking more like this. Between the upper box and Yuma, there are 5 valleys named the Gila Valley, most of them emphasizing the, as if they were the only, the original, or the most important. The redundancy says something about the disconnectedness of the Gila's users, though in fact they're all bound to the health of the same river and would all benefit from better cooperation. The Gila Cliff Valley is the first of the Gila's broad river valleys. In every one of them, the river takes a beating. Its waters are diverted, its channel is dammed, fenced, bridged, deforested, and engineered in mostly failed attempts to constrain the river's natural tendency to flood and meander, or to force it to respect rectilinear property lines and surveyed right-of-ways. In every subsequent canyon, the river recovers a bit of what it lost in the valley, until at last it cannot overcome the cumulative abuse, and it disappears. But the Gila Cliff Valley is a long way from the end of the Gila, and it probably still looks much the same as it did shortly after the first farms and ranches were homesteaded here in the 1870s. With the farms come fences and dams, of course, and bank erosion and beavers that make strainers out of many cottonwood trees that grow and fall along the riverbanks. It's a pleasant enough place to paddle. If I lived there, my canoe would get more exercise than it does here in Phoenix, especially for sunrise and sunset floats. There are convenient river access points at Mogollon Creek, the old iron bridge, and a number of spots along Bill Evans Road, and at the U.S. Forest Service Gila River Bird Area, which is located in the biggest and best cottonwood gallery forest on the entire Gila River. It's truly an amazing spot. Next up is the middle box. I had more fun paddling the middle box than I've had in a boat in years outside of Grand Canyon. It's a Class 2 to Class 4 whitewater thrill ride down a breathtaking bedrock canyon. The most exciting part of this magnificent 9-mile canyon is a 1.5-mile segment called the Narrows, where house-sized boulders and sheer granite cliffs limit the open channel to little more than the width of a boat. I'll show you some videos that give you a better explanation of what I'm talking about. I'd come around a bend, hearing the roar of an approaching rapid and seeing what looked like the entire river blocked by boulders. I'd approach as slowly as I could because the cliffs were too sheer to allow me to stop and scout. And then at the last second, I'd see a line, and I'd paddle like mad to get there, hit, drop, come on through, and then start all over again for the next one. Running these gauntlets in a fully loaded hard-shell open canoe made for an extra challenge. A lighter, more nimble boat would probably have performed better, although I did just fine. In retrospect, an inflatable kayak or pack raft might be better suited for bouncing off cliffs and boulders. Other than the risk of drowning, destroying my boat, or the lack of credible written descriptions of the canyon, it's the lack of access that keeps most of the boaters out of the middle box. Getting into the middle box isn't difficult if you don't mind starting a few miles upstream at the Gila River bird area. But there's no legal access to the river downstream until Highway 92, well below the lower box, unless you know someone who lives in the Red Rock Valley. So running the middle box either means trespassing in the Red Rock Valley, which I don't recommend, or floating all the way to Highway 92, making it a 36-mile trip. The middle box is one of the reaches that would be protected under the M.H. Salmon Wild and Scenic River Act, and it needs it. Believe it or not, in the past, the federal government has proposed building a dam that would have flooded this incredible canyon. It was a lot of fun. And you get through the rapids and you're just smiling all day long. The Red Rock Valley lies between the Gila's middle and lower boxes. It's much less populated than the Gila Cliff Valley. But the few residents that live there want you to know one thing. They want you to go away. Even their welcome sign lets you know that anything you could possibly want to do in Red Rock isn't allowed. The river itself and the valley are pleasant enough, but the cows have trampled and eaten much of the bank vegetation and caused channel bank erosion problems, particularly in the upper valley. Resulting erosion has toppled some of the remaining cottonwoods, creating strainers, some of which are nasty at low flow and might be even more challenging at high flow. But access is the biggest obstacle to enjoying this stretch of the Gila. During our scouting trip, we drove down the dead-end, unpaved road that leads into Red Rock. As we explored every conceivable way to access the river, we saw more locked gates and no trespassing signs than cows, which is saying something in a farm valley. Every one of the river access points I'd read about online or heard about from other paddlers was blocked off and signed. Even the state's bridge, which should have had enough right-of-way to allow public access to the river, had signs saying there was no parking or stopping or any kind of river access. I doubt those signs are legal, but it's not the kind of place where you argue with the locals. New Mexico's state constitution specifically reserves the public's right to use state waterways. But recently, some wealthy landowners have tried to influence state agencies and lawmakers to overwrite the Constitution and turn their rivers into pay-to-play private reserves. The New Mexico Stream Access Group, a coalition of river runners, fishermen, hunters, and hikers, are fighting back with legal challenges to prevent this from happening. After seeing all the no trespassing signs on our scouting trip, I decided to just paddle straight through from the middle box to the lower box in one day, staying on the river so I could start and end my day on public lands. The Gila's lower box is a paradise, a true desert oasis. Paddling it is a treat. There are no rapids to speak of. For the most part, I paddled a gentle current in the shade of large cottonwoods that fill the canyon floor. The narrow canyon is bounded by 300-foot vertical cliffs riddled with hidden slot canyons that just beg to be explored. I saw coati and deer and heard coyotes and saw tracks from lots of other critters. The bird population is amazing. The Audubon Society designated the lower box as an important bird area that is home to more than 170 species. Dutch Salmon told me it was his favorite Gila River Canyon, which suggests that the fishing is pretty good too. This little paradise is part of a BLM, or Bureau of Land Management, wilderness area, which managed to exclude cattle from the canyon beginning in 1990. The recovery of riparian vegetation since the cattle were kicked out is as remarkable as it was predictable, as shown by these side-by-side aerial photographs from 1998 to 2014. After years of trying to get the U.S. Forest Service to obey their own laws and keep cattle out of the river bottoms on forest lands, the Center for Biological Diversity recently filed suit to force them to create the same kinds of cattle exclusions on the Gila, Verde, and Salt Rivers that the BLM has in the lower box. When the center prevails, and they will, just imagine the new oases that will reappear along these rivers. Access to the lower box is a little better than to the middle box or the Red Rock Valley, though starting in the Red Rock Valley itself isn't currently an option. But there are dirt roads that lead right to the canyon's rim, and if Sunset Dam isn't draining the river dry at the end of the lower box, you can float an extra 3 miles out to the Highway 92 bridge and legally exit there. While I was paddling through the lower box, American Rivers announced that it had named the Gila as America's most endangered river of 2019. I took that as a foreshadowing of what I'd find downstream. The Gila flows out of the lower box and into the Duncan Valley, which also marks its transition from New Mexico to Arizona. Unfortunately, Arizona's track record with preserving its rivers is not as good as New Mexico's. There are currently 3 diversion dams in the Duncan Valley, all of which are capable of completely draining the river during most of the irrigation season. If it weren't for downstream water rights, they would. From what I could see from my canoe, the residents of the Duncan Valley don't value the Gila for anything other than the water it delivers to their canals. Unlike all of the upstream regions, I didn't see any fishing camps, fire rings, and clearings by the river, trails, tree houses, rope swings, or anything that would suggest that they use the river anything other than delivering irrigation. Instead, what I saw was farm levees, old tires piled up to keep levees from eroding, trash dumped over the levees into the river, and the kind of damage to the riverbanks that's all too common when cows graze in the river bottom. Paddling was pleasant enough, with birds and beaver and blue skies and a steady current, and occasional glimpses of snow-capped Mount Graham in the distance. But once again, I had the river to myself, floating along without seeing another person or a boat, like every other time I floated this reach of the Gila. It was as if the river had been forgotten. In Arizona, if someone tells you they're going to float the Gila, most of the time they mean they're going to run the Gila box, because it's the most popular Gila run in Arizona. In fact, I'd guess that most Arizona boaters are only vaguely aware that other parts of the Gila are boatable. The Gila box is a spectacular desert canyon with stunning bedrock cliffs, nice swimming holes, great riverside campsites, and peaceful cottonwood groves, and all the wildlife you'd expect to find where there's water, shade, and food. On my trips, I've seen all the usual critters, as well as bears, mountain lions, bighorn sheep, and what I'm pretty sure was a jaguar. And of course, Gila monsters. Most of the Gila box is located within the Gila River National Riparian Conservation Area, a type of federal wilderness, which was established in 1990 to preserve this unique canyon. The Gila box is managed by the BLM, the Bureau of Land Management, which employs a full-time river ranger and maintains river access points at each end of the canyon, charging a mere $3 for a permit to run the river with no reservation required. You just show up, drop your money in the pay box, self-pay box, and launch. The BLM managed to exclude cattle from the canyon floor, which has helped the riparian vegetation to recover and remarkably improve the bird and animal habitat. The Gila box, is runnable by canoe all year if you pack light and don't mind a little boat dragging. But it's best when the snow is melting in the mountains or if the river comes up during the monsoon season. Just before I left Duncan, I met some locals in a cafe who told me about a drowning that occurred a week before my trip. The young man who drowned was kayaking and became entangled in a strainer while trying to help a friend who had flipped his boat. Not the kind of story my wife wanted to hear just before I launched on a solo trip. Just after I passed the old Safford Bridge, 2 guys in matching neon green outfits flagged me down and asked if I'd seen anything interesting. Pretty much everything I'd seen in the last 200 miles fit that description, but he went on to tell me that he was part of the search and rescue team looking for the drowned kayak. He's also the manager of the Subia Ranch, which straddles the river just below the old Safford Bridge, and a descendant of the family that homesteaded it in the 1830s when this was all still in Mexico. A few months later, he emailed me to tell me that he had finally found the body miles downstream near Eagle Creek while tracking down a cow that had slipped past his fence. It was a timely reminder to practice good boater safety. The Gila has its moments of beauty in the Gila Valley near Safford, Arizona, but this valley is where the Gila takes its first serious hit. This valley is all about irrigated farming. The Mogollon people were farming and irrigating here 2,000 years ago. Today, farms line the entire valley floor for 40 miles, and every farm acre is connected to an irrigation diversion. Upstream, the diversion dams have the capability to completely drain the river. Here, the valley's 6 major diversions actually do it, at least during the driest parts of the irrigating season. Most of the farms have built up dirt levees to try to keep the river out of its floodplain and off their farm fields, but with only minimal success. Unfortunately, these levees have also become dumping grounds for all manner of trash. At one point, the river became so clogged with an acre-sized mat of floating garbage that I had to carefully pole my way through it. It was disgusting. After several days of paddling past trash-covered levees, diversion dams, and the remnants of failed erosion protection structures, it occurred to me that I hadn't seen any river parks, river access points, river trails, beaches, or riverfront homes. Everything I saw suggested that the locals see the Gila as something to be protected from, rather than something to protect. It seemed like they viewed the river as their enemy. It was depressing. Then it got worse. The last 30 miles of the Gila River, Gila Valley, above San Carlos Reservoir, is infested with tamarisk, also known as salt cedar. Paddling through tamarisk is unpleasant. Tamarisk is an invasive tree species that has plagued river corridors in the American West since being brought from Europe in the mid-1800s as an erosion control measure. A single tamarisk plant can produce 250 million seeds per year, consume 200 gallons of water per day, and grow 14 feet per year. It survives droughts, floods, heat, cold, salty soils, poison, fire, most pests, and being chopped down and dug up. It has no natural predators in the United States and spreads like the zombie apocalypse, especially where our river's natural flood cycle has been altered by dams or irrigation. By 1970, tamarisk had spread over more than 1 million acres of floodplain in the West. The tamarisk jungle at the end of the Safford Valley is just one of several major infestations along the Gila. Paddling through a tamarisk jungle is no treat, though it would have been worse in summer when the tamarisk fully leafed out. But even in the worst of the tamarisk infestation, there are hopeful signs. At one point, completely by surprise, I broke out of the tamarisk and paddled a half mile through a beautiful cottonwood grove. Magical. I could see the sky and hear birds. Sunlight filtered through the cottonwood leaves. There were no strainers. It was so nice. And then, just as suddenly, I was back in the tamarisk swamp. But even where the river is overrun with tamarisk, it's still a river. And when the river has water, it retains some of its magic. The last 25 miles of the Gila Valley is buried under San Carlos Reservoir, or it would be if the reservoir were ever full. At the dam's dedication in 1928, after seeing the nearly empty reservoir, humorist Will Rogers quipped, "If this were my lake, I'd mow it." After confining most of Arizona's Apaches to the San Carlos Indian Reservation in the late 1800s and expecting them to become farmers, the United States then decided to flood their only viable cropland under the reservoir. Adding to the insult, they decided that the Apaches weren't entitled to any of the reservoir's water. But they did name the lake after them. The San Carlos Apache tribe retains control of the lands around the reservoir, as well as the river coming into it, and derives some revenue from fishing and boating on the lake. From what I've seen on their website, I don't think they consider river boating at all. Once I paddled onto tribal land along the river, I didn't expect to see anything other than more than 20 more miles of tamarisk-choked channel. But what I found was surprisingly pretty. The birding is fantastic along the river corridor, but once I reached the delta, it just blew my mind. It has by far the richest diversity of water birds anywhere in Arizona, and I had it all to myself. Speaking of blowing my mind, once I got out on the lake, a strong headwind kicked up some nasty 2-foot waves that nearly swamped me. River canoes don't belong on lakes. Rockhouse Canyon, just below Coolidge Dam, is my favorite. It's rarely boated because access at the dam requires special permission from the San Carlos Apache tribe. There are other ways into the canyon, but they're more difficult, and you miss some river miles immediately below the dam. Rockhouse Canyon is my favorite because of its spectacular scenery, the remoteness, the wildlife, the geology and history. There are fun rapids, but none are particularly challenging, and there are some long, quiet pools, unlike the rest of the Gila. It has its own version of the Narrows, a place that's called Eye of the Needle. Canyon's only boatable when the dam releases water, and the dam only releases water when downstream irrigators have rights to the water. All of the releases follow the river until it reaches the Ashhurst-Hayden Dam, 72 miles downstream. Essentially, the river between the two dams is a canal, delivering scheduled water from one dam to the other. Granted, it's the prettiest canal you'll ever see, but it's something less than a river. In the last 9 miles of the canyon, the river flows within a few hundred feet of Highway 77, making that stretch a nice day run with an easy shuttle. Because the dam eliminates most of the floods, the run can be somewhat strainer-filled, like this one here, given that the floods tend to clear out the strainers. Still, when it's flowing, it's a nice place to get some paddle time in, within a short drive of Phoenix. For a few years after the 93 flood, there was even a sponsored boat race in the reach along the highway that attracted several hundred boaters. The Gila's 22 river miles between the town of Winkleman and Kelvin are neither a deep canyon nor a wide valley. It's something in between. San Pedro River, shown in this slide, joins the Gila just below the town of Winkleman, though it rarely contributes more than a trickle of flow. I camped here at the Confluence with the ghosts of Father Canoe, beaver trappers like Kit Carson and James Ohio Patty, and General Stephen Kearny's Army of the West from the Mexican-American War, all of whom stopped here and camped. But for my part, my night was haunted only by ATVs, loud mining equipment, and barking dogs. When Coolidge is releasing, it's an easy run with great birding, possibly the best on the entire river. There are some fences and plenty of strainers to squeeze past, and any views beyond the overhanging trees tend to be of the huge slag piles at the nearby copper mines. River access is easy in Winkleman and at Kelvin, but is limited by private land and no public roads in between. So once you start, you're probably committed for the whole 22 miles. Interestingly, unlike the other reaches of the Gila in Arizona, the locals seem to enjoy and care about the river. I've often seen people camping and fishing and tubing or boating above and below Winkleman. Cochrane Canyon is the last of the Gila's major canyons and one of its prettiest. I saw my first and second mountain lions here in Arizona in this reach, a mother and its cub silently walking along a beach just ahead of me as I floated towards them. The canyon has its share of strainers, including the one I'll show you next, the deadliest strainer I encountered during my trip. It had a nasty undertow with no way to portage around it, leaving me no choice but to carefully climb through and drag my canoe after me. But overall, paddling Cochrane Canyon is pleasant, with great views, big trees, a nice current, and a quick, scenic shuttle route. That all ends at the Ashurst-Hayden diversion. There, the entire river is sucked into an irrigation canal, leaving behind a dry riverbed. Downstream, the Gila is barely distinguishable from the desert around it. Even though I knew this was coming, after spending weeks on paddling a living, flowing river, seeing its death at the diversion dam was a shock. At the time, this is what I wrote in my journal. I arrived at the Ashurst-Hayden Dam unceremoniously. For the last 331 miles, I had continuous current that swept me powerfully downstream, sometimes much faster than I wanted to go. Here I had to paddle across a small pool of stagnant standing water to reach the low dam that held back the river, backing it up so it could be swallowed by the diversion. I paddled until Blue's bow bumped into the sheet metal flashing that tops the dam, and we stopped, looking out over what used to be the Gila. No songbirds graced this stagnant pool. On the bank, a great blue heron leaned forward and unfolded, taking off, heading back to the tree-lined channel upstream. Two mallards sat in a lonely mud puddle downstream of the dam, the only remnant of water remaining in the river below. Further downstream, the river was indistinguishable from the desert surrounding it. In the distance, a dust devil twirled above the dry riverbed. I sat for a long time on Blue's webbed seat, floating on the murky pool, bumping up against the iron flashing, looking across the dam at the dry riverbed below and pondering the things I'd seen in the last few weeks. Even at its worst, the Gila had been an oasis. It's a hell of a thing to kill a river, to take it all, to just shut it off, to erase it from the landscape. What hubris. We didn't just kill the Gila, we also killed all the wild things that fed off it and every future generation of all those species, as if nothing about an exotic river was important enough to preserve by just leaving a sliver of flowing water, as if an extra acre of alfalfa outweighed the value of a ribbon of green trees, the music of Niads and the rocky riffles, the cry of blackhawks, the sharp slap of a beaver's tail, or the feeling of peace beside still waters. The Gila was dead, and all its water was flowing in a concrete canal, but I still had 274 miles to go before reaching the Colorado River. So I climbed on my mountain bike and started riding west, following the canals closest to the river as best I could. The story of this part of the Gila belongs to the Yakimel O'odham, the river people. Their ancestors were here farming before the Roman Empire was founded, and they were still farming when the Spanish missionaries and explorers first visited them in the 1500s. And when the Americans started trekking through in the early to mid-1800s, the Yakimel O'odham welcomed them as they had the Spanish and supplied them with food and expanded their fields to meet the increased demand. In response to their generous, welcoming, and entrepreneurial spirit, Americans stole their water, dried up their fields, and literally forced them into starvation. It is a heinous tale of greed, corruption, and brutal indifference. Our government and our justice system denied their claims to the Gila's water, ignoring their more than 2,000 years of prior use. In spite of this injustice, the Akimel persistently pursued their legal claims, waiting more than 100 years before the Arizona Water Settlement Act of 2004 restored some of their water rights. Today, the Gila River Indian community is bustling with renewed farming activity, as well as with river restoration projects that returned a small measure of the Gila's flow and habitat to the river. Their work is a point of light in one of the bleakest sections of the ruined Gila. Amazingly, after all this, an Arizona state senator in 2018 introduced legislation intended to take back the Akimel's water. Thus far, the legislation has not passed. At one time, the Salt River more than doubled the Gila's flow when it joined the Gila near Phoenix. Today, both rivers are dammed and diverted and normally dry. Unless they're flooding, both rivers are largely ignored. And I doubt that 1 in 1,000 Phoenicians could find the Gila River without asking Siri for help. But 6 million Phoenicians take a lot of showers and flush a lot of toilets, which after the wastewater is cleaned at Phoenix's state-of-the-art treatment plant and at Tres Rios wetlands, it's released into the Salt River just above the Gila Confluence. It's not a lot of flow, but it's enough for a delightful menagerie of fish, beaver, and water birds, and enough to paddle a canoe or kayak for 4.5 miles until it is all diverted into yet another irrigation canal. After that, I was back to my bike and the canal road until I reached Gillespie Dam 35 miles downstream. The Lower Gila Collaborative is an intergovernmental working group that sees the potential of this urban Gila River to provide habitat, recreation, and open space in an area that desperately needs a living river. Whatever other problems this section of the Gila may have, it has water, which separates it from 99% of the other watercourses in Arizona, making it worth protecting, preserving, and enhancing. Their work offers hope, vision, and potential for this abused section of the Gila. The only thing I'll say about this section is that I took advantage of rare releases from the Salt River Salt and Verde reservoirs and paddled almost all of the 41 normally dry river miles between the dams. But it's a tale that needs more time to tell well. Suffice to say that it involved a disappearing river, the worst Tamarisk jungle I've ever seen, a survival experience, and just possibly an unplanned helicopter ride. You'll just have to read the book to find out the rest of the story. Downstream of Painted Rock Dam, the Gila is as dead as it was below the Ashurst-Hayden diversion dam. This was not always the case. When the 49ers crossed Arizona on the southern route to the California goldfields, dozens of them built or used boats to lighten their loads and float the last 100 miles to Yuma. In Yuma's early days, steamboats occasionally traveled 20 miles upriver to the gold boom town of Dome, at least until the railroad arrived and the Gila's water was diverted. Had there been towns further upstream, they might have traveled even further. In fact, in 1891, one Arizona newspaper reported that floating to Yuma on flatboats was the latest fad. Today, the Gila rarely flows below Painted Rock Dam. The river is littered with failed and failing farms, as even groundwater becomes too scarce and expensive to pump. Only the farms near Yuma survive, kept alive by diversions from the Colorado River, by pumping ever-dwindling groundwater supplies, and by cashing in on billions of dollars of federal subsidies to publicly funded infrastructure. Yet even there, amid 120 miles of bone-dry riverbed, there are signs of hope. While looking for the Oatman Massacre Memorial Site, Kate bumped into the manager of the Oatman Flats Ranch at a locked farm gate. The Oatman Flats Ranch is not just another River Valley farm, barely breaking even, growing alfalfa, or slowly killing its water source by doing things the way they've always been done. For centuries, the Hohokam and their descendants grew drought-tolerant, heat-resistant varieties of wheat and other crops in southwest Arizona. Father Kino brought desert-adapted fruit trees from Mexico that were used for generations by Arizona's native people. Oatman Flats Ranch is growing these species on a commercial basis and using cutting-edge organic regenerative farming techniques such as minimum tillage, livestock management, and polyculture to produce holistic farm food products, while cutting their water use by up to 50% of that used on comparable alfalfa farms. They hope to become a model in sustainable farming for the entire Gila River. All we need to do is stop doing things the way they've always been done. On the most basic level, my trip was an adventure. For any of my fellow river rats who are listening in, that's probably enough. The Gila has some wonderful places, and I got to see them. Mine was the first such trip in 118 years, and I was the first ever to have gone alone, as far as my research tells me. I'd be delighted to find others who've done it, but so far I haven't. But there are other deeper lessons to be learned from my tour of America's most endangered river. Most importantly, rivers are precious. We just have to decide how precious they are and what we're willing to give up to save them. I was devastated seeing the pointless death of the Gila at the Asher's-Taden Dam. I hope the photos and videos I showed you from the upper Gila gave you a sense of what we've lost. Sitting by the river the day I reached that dam, I'd have gone pretty far down this list to get my river back. Second, our shared history took us inevitably down a path that has killed too many of our rivers. I don't think anyone delights in the destruction of a river, and yet here we are. But just because there were good reasons at the time for the decisions we made doesn't mean that we can't rethink and undo those decisions when they no longer make sense. Imagine if we just discovered the Gila River today. Would we value growing alfalfa for foreign markets over a living river? Would we allow anyone to divert the entire river, leaving it completely dry and killing off nearly every wild thing that lived there? Of course not. Then why do we allow it to continue? But since that's where we are today, we need to carefully steward and enhance what's left. Already, many people have that vision, and they're fighting to save the Gila. And there's reason to hope. The Upper Gila diversion projects were defeated. Significant portions of the Gila may be designated wild and scenic. The Gila Watershed Partnership has proposed a river park for the town of Safford, of all places, and has completed some restoration projects in the Gila Valley. The Gila River Indian community is using some of their restored water allocation for habitat restoration. The Lower Gila Collaborative is reviving the urban Gila, Phoenix, and will make it a destination again. Oatman Flats Ranch is pioneering restorative, sustainable farming techniques. Even along the driest, most disturbed parts of the Gila, there's reason to hope. Even with all we've done wrong, there's still a good chance to make it better. What can you do? Well, there's a long list of nonprofit and intergovernmental agencies who are working to improve the Gila. Google one. Ask how you can join in. If you just want to float the river, there are paddling resources to get you on your way. I'd recommend starting with the Facebook group, Gila River Paddlers. Lots of information that can be found there. And of course, you can read the book. Here's some ways you can get a copy for yourself. And I should note that the sales made a result of this presentation directly benefit the sponsor of this talk. So thanks for listening in. Hope to see you on a river someday. In the meantime, my email address is there, or use the Q&A box and I'll answer whatever questions we've got. Thanks again for listening in.